Fafa is what they'll say every single time, like a kick in the guts.
I'd run off and I'd cry.
Here comes Yopo, the Fafa.
When kids in the village would sing that in front of Dad.
Se soia.
Oi, Soy, you get so angry.
Yopo!
Yeah.
Tari, son, walk like a man.
Our sister would catch us wearing your stuff.
But I thought I looked pretty.
At dances in the village, I'd want to put on the Tulinga headdress.
Then, the whole village would stare. It would laugh. The light went dark, and I felt nothing. But I'd go to the mountain.
And dance by the waterfall.
Being free was a beautiful thing. If I leave, I'll take my roots with me. A piece of home to carry.
In my blood.
Hold on tight.
As I shift in the wind, I'll land and plant these pieces, and I'll grow. Walk like a man, Yopo. That's what Dad used to yell. Nah. I reckon I'll walk just like me.
Sao malosi ilelalolangi ai wangalo yatea uole sili ese olelangi uina o savali ile pongisa ai salofa mai oia ole
Hey folks, get the latest batch of free marketplace content. Start creating the next big thing with 2 templates to help you build a multiplayer-ready action RPG or an endless runner shooter game. Flesh out a ruined environment with a modular kit and gritty up your worlds with a prop bundle. And don't forget to add special effects to your materials. Download all of these from the marketplace within the next month before they're gone. And while you're there, prepare to show off your products with a virtual showcase environment or release the Kraken from the permanent collection. The Unreal Engine 427.2 hotfix is now available on the Epic Games Launcher and GitHub. Update today to secure the latest round of fixes from our team. See the complete list of updates on the 427.2 forum topic. Breaking into the indie world, Ratloop Games Canada emerged with a sharp focus on gameplay. In their time-warping, turn-based multiplayer FPS Limnus Gate, they took a risk blending such unique genres, but it's paying off. Dive into our development interview with game director James Anderson on the Unreal Engine feed to learn more about how the team struck the balance between first-person action and turn-based strategy. In this week's EOS update, learn how to use the Player Data Storage Service to save and retrieve player data from an Epic Online Services backend. This will include uploading, reading, duplicating, and deleting files, querying them, and more. Head to dev.epicgames.com/news to retrieve the information for yourself. Now over to this week's top karma earners. Many thanks to Lupoiso, Every Nun, Clockwork Ocean, Chastoffer Boy, Kahel18, Jay Swigert, Minehold, S Lake, Logan Ahogan, and Cheerer. Compete in fast-paced aerial combat in the free-to-play Century Age of Ashes, this week's first spotlight. Master a growing roster of classes and dragons, and dive into the arena alone or with friends and fight for your survival. From Playwing, Century Age of Ashes is now available on PC and consoles. Next up is In the Deep, Dark and Dangerous' first episode, A Ride to Nowhere. The 20-minute film was all put together by Taran Sharma with writing assistance from their sisters. Check out the lovely film on their website.
You guys really want to know about these jungles? Huh? It's scary.
Yes.
We're vibing with virtual recording artists The Original Pink Boy, Teflon Sega's latest series of music videos and virtual concerts. Seen here is Paralyzed's music video created for Halloween. Their videos are entirely self-produced using Unreal Engine and a mocap suit. Visit Teflon Sega's YouTube channel to watch all their bumpin' content. Thanks for watching this week's news and community spotlight. Hi, and welcome to Inside Unreal, a weekly show where we learn, explore, and celebrate everything Unreal. I'm your host, Amanda Shade, and I'm really excited to announce our guests from Mold3D Studio today. So first we have Edward, the creative director and owner.
Hey guys.
Jesus, the UE technical director. And
Hello.
Travis, head of Look Dev. Welcome. All right, so thanks for joining us.
Thank you for having us today.
We're going to talk about how you all worked on Slay and made the incredible animated short. I know I was blown away when I first saw it. It's a really, really beautiful piece, so you should definitely be proud of the work you've done with it. And you're going to dig into some of the art and inspiration behind the project?
Yeah, we're going to be covering a little bit of everything today about the making of it and what inspired us and what kind of got us started on this project.
Awesome.
So yeah, I guess, should I take it away?
Yeah, dive right in.
Great. All right, let me share my screen. Cool. Well, thank you everyone for joining us today. We're going to be talking about everything from like the thought process of how the Slay came about to what inspired us, the influences that we looked at to get us going with the story. And then we're going to dive into a little bit of the concept art and the design and just how we kind of built this world. And then afterwards, we'll take some questions and show some stuff inside of Unreal as well if there's time. So I wanted to first talk about how we came about making Slay and how the idea came about. Initially, just a little background about myself. My name is Edward Quintero. I'm the owner and founder of Mold3D. My background is actually visual effects and feature animation. So it wasn't until like around this time when we started Mold3D Studio that I got involved with real-time production. And that was an exciting time for me because I had already been working in the industry for about 15 years. And I was having fun, but I also started getting kind of jaded because after a while, it's just, you kind of feel like you're doing the same thing. And, traditional visual effects and animation had been pretty much this, the same kind of technology. Things improved a little bit year to year, but for the most part, it was the same. And when I started to discover VR and AR when that came out, I was really intrigued and I started kind of looking deeper into it and asking myself, like, what's behind this technology? And I discovered that it was real-time platforms like Unreal Engine. And so I wanted to learn more about it. And so I started diving into that type of work. I actually was lucky enough to do some contract work for Epic Games. This was pre-Fortnite back in the day. I actually worked on Paragon for a bit, and I worked on the Robo Recall game. And so that was kind of my first like real introduction to Unreal, coming from, you know, being an artist working in programs like Maya. And so that was an eye-opening experience for me. And at that point, I decided, you know what, I want to get into this. I want to devote my career and my studies into real time. And at the time, I was at DreamWorks Animation, and I had decided, you know, I'm just going to go for it. I want to start my own studio and really just head on deep into this world of real time. And so through that experience, you know, I started also getting introduced to virtual production, and that's when Mold3D Studio was kind of born. I created Mold3D Studio to take on this type of real-time work. And I don't know if it was the timing, because it was before Mandalorian, but I guess I'll call it luck. We just got lucky, and we got the exciting opportunity to work on the Mandalorian. Actually, we worked on season 1 and 2. And I also worked at this place called Fox VFX Labs, which was the original introduction to virtual production. And I learned a lot about how Unreal Engine was being used to create or to help filmmakers create and visualize their films. And at Fox Labs, we actually used Unreal to pitch to a studio. We were working on this film called Mouse Guard at the time. We pitched to the studio the actual movie through a number of sequences that were done entirely in Unreal. And after that, I was just totally hooked. And since then, Mold3D Studio has worked on a lot of cool projects. We're also really lucky to be involved with the UE5 demo, and we've also done some metaverse type stuff. But primarily, we're working in a lot of VAD, virtual production based projects. And I just mentioned VAD. VAD is what they call Virtual Art Department, and I would say that was kind of what defines Mold3D Studio. We're essentially an art department, but we do our work, you know, through real time engines like Unreal, and it's all virtual and obviously remote because of the pandemic. So all this stuff kind of works together. And yeah, let me dive into a little bit of the Slate part here. Move on to the next slide here. So yeah, so Slate came about me pitching to Epic after we had already been working in some virtual production projects. I wanted to do a final pixel animated short. Up until that point, we hadn't worked in animation. We've been doing more like environments and asset building and lighting and creating really nice high fidelity work, but we hadn't done like a story. And so I pitched to Epic Slay for multiple reasons. We wanted Slay to be kind of like a test bed for Mold3D to experiment and to learn how to create an animated narrative content inside of Unreal. So that was one of the reasons. But we also wanted to learn and grow through the process. And we also wanted to share that knowledge, like everything that we went through. Out of it, we wanted to be able to then put that information together in some kind of way and share that. And so the pitch to Epic was to create a short story, and then from there we'd create some educational content that would also be able to teach others our experience and all the processes and techniques and even the challenges that we went through to create this short. So a little bit about the actual short itself. Initially, it was a longer piece. It was going to be about like 5 minutes. It was super ambitious. We had like, I think it was 5 environments that we were going to do, and it was going to be like 5 minutes long. Like it was a lot. And
yeah,
I think it.
I was going to say like the stuff that you showed me was like, I always love getting lost in the art of stuff, and especially like early concept work, I am just a sucker for. So I always get lost in all of it, and then it's always afterwards where I then go back to my seat, sit down, and I'm like, oh god, we have to do this. Like there's a lot of stuff in there. But yeah,
exactly. And it's, I think that's also very typical of filmmaking from, you know, just things I've seen on interviews from filmmakers and whatnot. Like you always have this like really ambitious idea, and then it needs to, and then it changes through the process because there's a lot of reality that sets in, and in our case, you know, things like time and budget and the pandemic. That's one thing too that happened to us, was that when we actually started production on Slade, that week we sent everybody home. That was when the pandemic was like at its full peak. And it was like an industry-wide thing. Like everybody was being sent home. And so here we were like about to start like the most ambitious project we've done as a group. And now we had to learn how to do it like at home. And we had no pipeline for that. We didn't know how we were going to do, the interaction and all that. And so that was obviously a challenge, but it was an interesting thing that kind of forced us to create our pipeline that we're still using today to do some client work as well. So, we could talk a little bit more about that later, but I want to get back to the story here. But yeah, it was definitely a challenging start for sure. But yeah, this is actually what you guys are seeing on the screen. This is actually a section of the original story that was longer. And when we started, this was actually going to be a very stylistic type of short. I was thinking, I was being influenced at the time from things like anime and Kung Fu cinema. And I wanted to kind of create this fun anime type of inspired thematic short.
Ooh, can we watch it?
And yeah, let's go ahead and play. But yeah, this was kind of like the ending of the original short. And when we realized that we wanted to go shorter in time, this felt like a perfect kind of thing to take from that short and make it its own little short demo, so to speak. So originally we had a different character for the female hero, and we ended up using going with Echo Windwalker, which is the character that was used for the Unreal 5 demo. And I'll explain a little bit about that here in a second.
No, but yeah, all the effects, all the water, all the foliage, so much rocks in the background. Again, when I first saw this, absolutely lost myself in just like the very much anime, references that you're, saying, the designs of like even Oni before Oni became what he is now. And that also we'll touch into in terms of like how he became who he is. But like, I absolutely lost myself into like, oh yeah, this would be so cool. This would be awesome. And then I sit down and open up Unreal and I'm like, oh, right, this has to be performant. This has to be optimized. We have to make sure this is running and that, all of our shots are coherent enough to, be able to have this all come together. I'm like,
yeah.
Oh, we have to have a conversation.
but being an artist and a creative, we just wanted to geek out and start with something fun. So we went, we threw everything at this and just kind of talking about what would be a fun thing to do. And at the end, a fight sequence kind of made sense for us because it kind of gave us the opportunity to explore different things, some animation, lighting, creating a really cool environment. Obviously in this animatic that you guys are seeing, the fight was in a different location. It was in a grotto, but we actually ended up in the temple. And I wanted to go talk about the temple because the temple became almost like an extension of a character. It became the main focus for us as a team in the sense of world building and creating something that felt really rich and I wouldn't say hyper realistic or photoreal, but it was something that was kind of a blend of like stylization and realism in the sense of like the textures and the look development and the lighting. We were trying to go for more of a realistic kind of look in that sense. But a little before we get into the design part, just continuing on with the story, for me, it was important to try to have like a start and an end, even though it was going to be, this thing ended up being like 1 minute. So it wasn't, to even call it a short is pretty generous because it's a short. But it was still very important for me to have some kind of start and end. And taking from that original story that we originally had, Slay was about a hero going through a journey. The hero could represent us or anyone, and how that hero needs to overcome some kind of obstacle. And so Slay, the actual name title of the project was, it's a little it's not the most original name in the world, but it's Slay, like slay the dragon, and also slay, like kick butt and overcome your own fears and getting through to the other side. So for me, the journey aspect of it was really important. So we started looking at some reference imagery that showed, you know, how do we represent a journey? And in this case, it implies, the short implies that Echo comes through, you know, into this clearing where we see the temple. So she's gone through some kind of journey. And we also knew that there was going to be a fight scene. So we started looking at reference from different movies that depicted fight scenes. In this case, we're looking at this shot from Gladiator, which is pretty relevant for us because another thing that we discovered along the way is that our fight arena, so to speak, which was the temple, was problematic in some ways because even though it was pretty to look at, it was hard to stage this fighting in a pleasing way because of the way that it ended up being designed. And we'll talk about the design. I want to show you guys how we went about designing the temple, but looking at imagery like this was really helpful because it informed us, like, how do you take something that might be busy, like in this case, the background looks kind of busy and you have like, you know, people and noise back there. How do you do the lighting design? How do you stage the camera to make it look interesting? And that was definitely a challenge throughout for us. And then here's just some more reference and inspirational imagery. I wanted that classic kind of, you know, kung fu duel between Echo and Oni. And just to talk a little bit about Echo, just to let you guys know why that decision was made to use Echo. I think that as we started kind of diving into the environment, we wanted to have something that was a little grittier, a little bit more realistic. And so in the conversation and the back and forth with Epic, they suggested that we could use the Echo character, and we thought that was a good fit because she had like this kind of mix that we were going for, which is this. It was a stylized kind of look, but it had like kind of realistic looking textures, and she's not necessarily like a Disney character, but she's not, you know, photoreal either, and that's the style that we ended up kind of going for. And I also liked you know, like I mentioned before, we worked on the UE5 demo, so the narrative that was slightly introduced in the demo itself, to me, I as an audience member watching it, I always was kind of curious of like, what other adventures can we see Echo in? Like, what kind of character is she? And when we were talking about how she might relate to our story, we kind of came up with this idea that Echo is like a Lara Croft, Indiana Jones type of character, where she has the ability to go to different exotic locations, and it's its own unique universe, but it still has that vibe of her being an explorer and traveling through different lands. And in this case, with Oni, who's our adversary in the story, you know, I was drawing back from that original story, which had the thematic themes of you know, Japanese culture, and like I was talking about before, like manga and anime and all that. So we wanted to keep that influence thematically, but still be able to make sense of the Echo storyline, if you will, and how that relates to her going to this new universe, this new exotic land. And another way that we tied the story to that original UE5 demo was I don't know if you guys remember, but in the demo, she's holding like this sphere. It's kind of like this glowing orb, and it kind of implied that she has some kind of magical power when she's holding it. At the end, she dives into the canyon and she's flying and all that. So we thought it'd be a cool idea that having her be like this kind of Lara Croft type of character, maybe she's in search for this orb. She lost it, or maybe it was stolen. And so her going into this temple is her searching for the orb, which is the source of power. And this character that you're seeing here is the Oni character that we came up, which was kind of like the guardian of this orb, if you will. So you know, it was a very simple kind of storyline, but we wanted to have that tie-in to something that the audience has seen before with this character. We thought that was an important aspect of it. Also, going back to these movie references, it's an interesting thing I wanted to point out. When we were collecting these images, and then we started getting to shots, it was interesting to kind of go back to these and look at them and see like, oh my God, like this shot, for example, from Mad Max is kind of similar to where we landed with the introduction of Oni. And that was actually wasn't on purpose. It was like maybe a subconscious choice, or who knows, but my point is that it's really important when you're starting out your own story to draw on those references and to look at a lot of images that might inspire you. And sometimes they make their way into your film and sometimes they don't, but just kind of getting that into the well of your visual library, so to speak, it was part of our process, at least. So I think I'd like to dive in now into kind of the design aspect of how we designed our. We'll talk today about the temple and the Oni character, because those were the two main contributions from Mold3D. So first, to start out with the temple, as I mentioned earlier, we were trying to stay true to things that we were looking at in real life, like Japanese temples and Chinese temples, and we paid a lot of attention to the architecture and to the details that make up these temples. But we also wanted to have fun with it. We wanted to be creative and kind of inject like this fantasy element to it to make it feel a little bit more original. So yeah, we looked at a lot of imagery. One of the things I wanted was kind of I didn't want it to feel scary, but we wanted it to feel imposing, like it's something that could be explored, right? So we were looking at imagery of different type of shapes. We also knew that it was going to be an open air environment, and especially in the courtyard where the fight takes place. So taking a look at images from different films or things that we found online that show different type of open air environments, and trying to explore how can we stage that in an interesting way to create nice shots and contrast and shadow and all that. Another fun fact, I'm an 80s kid, so one of my favorite TV shows back in the day was Thundercats. And I don't know how I came across this, but at some point I was like, oh yeah, the Thundercats layer. Like, I remember liking it. So I was looking at the images and I was like, what's cool about it? And it's like this tall structure in the middle, and we have these like imposing paws that come out and jut out towards us. And I thought that was an interesting kind of shape. So if you go look back at sorry about the switching here, going back to the temple, we have kind of a similar type of overall, form, where we have the tall shape of the temple in the middle, and we have what we call the dorms on the sides, and those kind of frame the entrance. Let's see here. Some of this stuff. These are just more images of reference that we pulled together. Some of it might be lighting reference or inspiration or staging or color, mood, that kind of thing. We also worked with some amazing concept artists. This is some artwork from my old friend Sam Mitchlap, who I worked with at DreamWorks Animation. And I explained in the beginning, we were going for a way more stylized look. It was going to be almost cartoony, right? So Sam, coming from feature animation, I thought would be a great person to work with. So he created some amazing color scripts for us. And we also worked with another awesome concept artist called Derek Zabrowski, who created some other color keys for us. As you can see here, there's some similar, for those of you guys that have seen the short, there's some similar shots that ended up in the short. But as you can see here, it was way more colorful and dark, which I thought was actually a pretty cool look. It's something that we initially explored, but it just started becoming problematic with the lighting, and we felt that it being outside, we wanted to create like a less cartoony look. So getting this kind of contrast and saturated colors didn't make as much sense as we went into our lighting design. So we started pulling away from this look and towards a more naturalistic type of look. Here's some more.
If you can back up to that one, because I do want to add something to that. And so just to add on with the lighting design that we ended up going with as well, is like the main reason why we really stopped with this overall like stylized version is because the continuity between each shot, like having to follow one after the other, would require such a drastic change from one to the next that it would actually be more work on our end, trying to like relight, hide buildings, because like as you can see on the right side, right middle, where Echo's holding the sword and go into that pose, she like all the light that's coming from her there versus like literally if you look at the one that's almost directly to her left, like to the left of that one, those are just two completely different lighting scenarios where it would be more of a pain to actually try to relight each individual scene. That would almost end it. That could actually potentially end up making us push the deadline or go, over the deadline of what we initially thought of in terms of like how long lighting would take us.
Yeah, and also an interesting thing that we discovered as we were lighting is that you look at this concept art and the lighting is beautiful, but it's kind of slightly different in every shot. So in some cases it comes from the right hand side, and others it comes from the front of the temple, and we had to keep consistency to some degree because in films there's you could do kind of whatever you want. I mean there's rules, but many times some filmmakers might change the composition or the framing or even the lighting direction just to suit the shot and to make it more appealing. So we knew that we had some flexibility, but as Jesus was mentioning, each one of these is so drastic that we had to kind of stick to one base foundation of lighting that could drive the shots moving forward. Actually, I'm going to jump ahead a couple frames here to show you kind of where we landed. So the top images are some examples of references that we were looking at that were a little bit more subdued, a little bit less saturated, more naturalistic in its lighting. So we're trying to look at that to pull ourselves back from that kind of stylized initial look that we were going for and go towards a more kind of naturalistic lighting scenario. And I think at the end of the day, it ended up being pushed a little bit more stylistic, but not as drastic as what those examples I just showed. Here's some more concept art. This is from Dirk Zabrowski as well. This is actually kind of closer to where we landed. It's not a one-to-one, but it's, we have like this light coming from the left, giving us some raking shadows and opportunity to get some contrast and mood. So we kind of went in this direction. There's another one, another piece from Derek that was also pretty similar to where we landed. Same here. One of the things that kind of helped us is the temple has two tiers. So we have like this tier at the bottom tier where she comes into the door, and then she comes up these stairs, and at the top it's more open air. So this kind of worked out in our favor because I wanted to have a sense of mystery, almost like she's kind of spelunking into a cave type of thing. So having this bottom tier, the doorway blocking the light gave us the opportunity to have more of a shadowed look, and her opening the door kind of having that beam of light coming in and revealing her entrance. And this is another key shot of her approaching the orb. Very Indiana Jones, her in the movie where he approaches the gold statue. It's kind of like that moment where she's approaching the treasure that she's after. This is just another concept piece that was early on as well. Her coming through her journey through a clearing and seeing the temple. And just some explorative type of shots of, outlining the duel that's about to take place between Oni and Echo. It doesn't really have any context in the final short here, but just another shot. We wanted to see kind of what that orb might look like. And so we chose, we went more for a cool color because the lighting design ended up being very warm for the entire short. So we wanted to kind of have some kind of complementary, cooler look for the orb to give us some contrast. Moving along to the temple design itself, I mentioned in the beginning that we were drawing on real life architecture. So we wanted to definitely include that, but we wanted to have fun and go for, inject some of that fantasy kind of vibe into this. So these were some early explorations to kind of give us a not weird, but a unique shape, but something that we haven't necessarily seen before, but still have some recognizable elements in there. Ultimately, we decided those were too tall because we wanted to have a arena of sorts for the characters to fight in. So we said, okay, we need to go wider. So we went a little wider here, and also wanted to give more kind of a tiered structure to the temple. Here's another pass. this is a little closer to where we landed, and this is the final that we landed at. So individually, each like one of these little components and sections of the temple contains a lot of architectural elements that exist in real life, and we'll kind of dive into those here in a second. And here are just some lighting explorations very early on. Initially, we're going for a more moody type of look. And here's kind of more or less where we landed, you know, more sunny, brighter, to show off the temple. And here was just some other concept art that we were exploring, some other environments. Like I mentioned earlier, it was a longer story. And so we had different environments that our character would have traversed through to get to the final fight. Okay, so yeah, I thought I'd just dive deep into a little bit more of the details of how we looked at reference to inform our design of the temple, and also help out the modelers, because at a certain point when you're working with concept art, you know, you get kind of a general, but when you start diving deeper into actually having to model and texture this stuff, it helps to have you know, as much real world reference as you can, or what we call out sheets, where we gather our reference and we give that to the 3D modelers and texture artists so that they could use that to try to mimic or get inspired. As you can see here on the left-hand side, we have some real temples. So we're looking at things of how the temple is constructed, what kind of materials it was made from. Down below you, there's actually an image from, I believe this is Spirited Away. So we were also kept looking at the concept art as well, to remind us that, hey, we want to have fun and try to make something that feels a little bit more magical and a little bit more fantasy. So that was just like a reminder for us to kind of keep the eye on the prize, so to speak, and go both ways. Here's an example of a call-out sheet, which is typical what we'd give our artists to make sure that they're looking at the reference and you know, being inspired by not only the look but the construction. Here's another call-out sheet. More temple, real-life temple examples. One of the things about temples, and for me at least, that I find so fascinating is how intricate they are, and there's so much detail. And you know, from a creative standpoint, it's just so rich and fun to dive into. So we were trying to take as much of these elements that we could without going overboard, because you know, sometimes too much detail could be a bad thing. So we wanted to keep that balance between noisy detail and fun things to look like, with areas that were larger and where your eyes could kind of rest when you look at the temple as a whole. Here's another example of things that we discovered as we were looking for reference. Like, a lot of these Japanese temples have so much detailing on the roof structures themselves, like everything from the end points of these ceramic tiles to these little sculptural details that you see at the top ends. We thought those were super interesting and fun. So we made sure to incorporate that into our modeling. This is a work in progress model here from the actual temple. As you can see, we started trying to incorporate some of that symbols, and down here you see some floral detailing here in the gold caps. And you don't even see this in the short at all. Like, it's one of those things that I guess you could call it an Easter egg for those of you that might have downloaded the sample project. If you fly around, you'll catch some of this detailing that we added.
Oh, also, I would like to say that our artists did a really good job in incorporating those designs and also those texture maps, so that way they're not, that they are a part of one whole object instead of each individual pieces, which allows the project itself to be much more performant, and for optimization allows us to just it allows for a smoother process. Otherwise, those are just like individual pieces. So our artist absolutely did a great job in including all these little details without it really impacting the scene too much. Early on, it's always a thing of like, the sky is the limit, and then we hit the limit, and then we're like, okay, maybe we should pull back.
Yeah.
But I like even for like the little Oni heads that are there, like absolutely every time I go into the project, I always just find something new that I wasn't looking at, that I was like, oh, they really did some more detail. And again, they hit the nail on the head of like making sure that their textures were were uniform in terms of incorporating like combining the entire roof into one map and still maintaining that texel density and that high and that quality, so that way that 4K maintains throughout the entire texture sheet and not just like individual pieces.
And the thing is, that was a little bit of a tease, that we're coming off the we helped out with that UE5 demo, so we're coming off of a project where we could create models that had like millions of polygons and just go insane because UE5, right? But then we had to go to at 4.26, which, not complaining, amazing, but we were like, okay, we can't do what we just did. We have to now think of optimization and how do we create all this intricate detail but still make it run. So it was definitely a challenge.
Yeah.
So yeah, these are just more examples of some real life reference that we looked at. One of the interesting things about our temple, I think, compared to like a traditional Japanese temple, is that we did want it to be in a location that was high in the mountains and kind of far away. So we looked at a lot of Tibetan temples as reference that are similar in the sense that they have some of the similar architectural detailing, but they're built on top of the structure of like brick and plaster. So that was an element that we kind of borrowed from in designing our temple as well. As you can see here, we have on the left hand side, that's one of the dorms that we created, and that plaster and brick type of look is reflected there. Also wanted to talk about that, materials themselves. So we used a lot of Megascan surfaces and photogrammetry-based textures and details because we were, as I mentioned earlier, we were trying to go for that realistic kind of look dev. And so for us, it's really important to try to draw from realistic sources as much as possible. And I mentioned earlier as well that we're going to be doing some educational content. So we actually have a look dev. One of our tutorials is actually covering how we approach the look dev process and how we use Megascans to layer in detail and try to make this look as rich as possible. I also mentioned construction. I wouldn't say the temple is 100% accurate everywhere, but we did look and study a lot of how these temples were constructed, and the beams, especially for like the entrances and gates and whatnot, they have a very specific way that they come together. In our research, we actually found out that if you look at this top right images, this construction is there's no nails involved. It's just like pegs and wood beams coming together, but they're so strong that most temples could withstand like pretty powerful earthquakes, apparently. So it was fun during the process of creating Slade to also learn about the history and just like architecture and just it's I think like anytime you create your own story and you're doing the research part of it, I think that's half the fun, and because you're learning and it's almost like an excuse to gain a new insight on something that you might not have known about before. This is an example of the section that contains the door when you enter the temple. So as you can see here at the top, we have some of those roof structures that I was just showing you guys. So in this case, our modeler did a fantastic job of really paying attention to how these things come together. Also, texture, colors, and materials. Like when we're doing this exercise of looking at our references, we have to ask ourselves, like, how old is the material? How aged is the temple in general? Is it a clean temple? Is it something that hasn't been touched in like 1,000 years? So trying to pick what coloring and weathering that our materials and textures had was integral to trying to support the narrative of the history of this temple. So something as trivial as like, is it more brown redwood versus more gray wood? Those things we had to look at and compare against the color scheme of the overall and see what fits and works best. Here's some of that other detailing we were talking about before. Here's our pass edit. Very kind of reminds me of something from Fortnite for some reason, just because it's got that stylistic look, but it's actually very accurate to the kind of look that you see in real temples. They're very kind of almost cute and cartoony looking. I don't know. There's something about him that looked really fun. There's also things like that didn't make it into the short, but we nevertheless, explored and looked at, and in some cases modeled. So this is an example of some statues that I think are traditionally placed in cemeteries as like guardians to ward off evil spirits. So this is the type of kind of research that we went into and started doing our own versions of this stuff to help decorate and set dress the environment. Some more examples here. Unfortunately, we didn't actually use these in the short. These were, we kind of went for less, yeah, they are. But I think the reason was, if I remember correctly, is because they looked a little too cute and they were too figurative, and we thought they might be distracting because we had our gravestones at the bottom floor as Echo enters the temple, and we didn't want the audience to see something that might be distracting, so we felt like it might not fit very well.
I had to double check because I totally thought I also saw those guys in there the first time around, and I had to like look in, and I can confirm, yeah, they're not in there, and I am depressed about it.
Yeah, maybe we should have put one in there as an Easter egg or something. Yeah. And so here's just another detailing, set dressing type of prop that we created. And this is a guardian lion. So on the left-hand side, we have some real-life examples, and then on the right is our final asset. And this isn't really temple related, but we things as trivial as Echo's sword. We could have just done a simple sword blade type thing, but we wanted to go that extra mile and try to keep it in line with the theme. So we looked at Japanese katanas and came across the fact that a lot of them have this very intricate sculptural detail that they place on the handle blades. So this is our katana for Echo. And so as you can see here, we went through the lengths of going into ZBrush and creating all this beautiful sculptural detail that no one will probably see, but we know it's there. So it's
I never saw
the artist. Yeah. No?
No, I didn't even know we went that far. I also just thought we used a normal katana. Like that's new to me.
Actually,
surprise.
Yeah.
Easter eggs everywhere.
Everywhere.
Cool. So now, yeah, I mean, that's the thing. If you have the sample project, just go just cruise around. You'll find a lot of stuff.
Yeah, take your time.
So I also wanted to talk a little bit about Oni, the character, because this was the character that we created for the short, and we wanted to have an imposing adversary for Echo to fight, and someone that was represented the guardian of this environment. So this is some initial concept art. This is from concept artist called Gopgap that I'm a huge fan of his work. He's got like a fun, playful kind of shape language to his designs. And this is when we were going to go more stylistic and I guess you could say cartoony. So he looks similar, but this was the initial kind of approach that we were going for. So definitely a lot more stylized in its proportions and all that. And I actually loved his design. I think it's really fun. I would say the main reason we didn't go in this direction for Oni is because when we put him aside next to Echo, it just didn't fit. It didn't feel right. Echo just had a slightly more realistic look, and it just didn't fit. It didn't feel like it would be in the same world or universe. So we started going towards a little bit more natural, human-esque anatomy at the end of the day. But another fun fact about Oni is that he had hair. Oni actually is bald in the short, but he actually had hair, and we were going to go for more like fur coat kind of vibe and just have a lot more kind of grooming going on. But this goes back to like the ambitions that you have when you start out trying to create your own, in this case, short. And we went as wild and as crazy as we wanted to or we aspired to. But in this case with the hair, realism settled and kind of told us like, hey, it's going to be hard for us to create hair and art direct it and also finish this short during the pandemic. So we had to make some concessions and decide like what do we want to sacrifice, and for the sake of not only the design but also the optimization and the feasibility of actually getting this thing done. Because one of the things that we were looking at here were like these long braids on Oni, and if you look at the fight, there's just like a lot of wild action. So imagine like these two long braids just whipping all over the place. It would have been a nightmare to art direct. So that was one of the first things that we cut, was the long hair. And then let me just go through a couple slides here. So this was actually where we were going to head in terms of the hair, because we were looking around for reference and trying to justify putting hair on Oni, but keeping it in line with something that might fit the theme. And so we came across this type of hairstyle that samurais used to wear, and we were like, hey, this is perfect. Like, it's all contained, you know, it's maybe a little gel
Keeps
on
it out of
it,
the way.
keep it all tight. Yeah. No flying wispy hairs. And we thought this would be cool. But at the end of the day, then the discussion came up of like, okay, are we going to do hair cards, or are we going to do a groom? And Amanda, you might know this, but I'm not 100% sure, but for 4.26, not sure how advanced the hair system was back then, but I believe it was fairly new. So we were kind of like, all right, you know, Echo had hair cards on the UE5 demo. Are we going to really try to push something so new? And this, you know, is that going to be a risky move? And ultimately, we just kind of decided to keep it a little simpler on Oni, and instead we went for the hair on Echo, which Epic did that portion of it. But the hair on Echo was also new at the time, and we thought that would be enough to kind of showcase the hair system, and instead kept Oni a little simpler. So
the same thing goes with the cape fur that he had on his back, where that was going into the same thing of like, that's a lot of stuff that we're going to be having on scene per shot. And then on top of that, like with how it's moving and having an artist having to detail all that out, it became a thing where we just had to have that conversation of like, I think we have to nix it. Like, because I absolutely loved the fur, and I loved his long, white, luscious locks that just whipped everywhere. But it became a performance thing where we knew, where before we even threw him into the engine and before we even had mocap on him, we knew that was going to be a piece of conversation that was going to start eating up our frame rate. So it was just, we had to rip that Band-Aid off earlier rather than later, because otherwise it's going to be a thing where we're like, well, yeah, but we put all this time into it. We can't just kill it. Look at it. It's so good. And it's like, but we need to. Stop. Don't do this.
And speaking of which, like go ahead, Amit.
Well, I was just going to say that brings up an important point about trying to determine like what elements of the design or the story or the environment contribute to telling the story, that, you know, the things you're really trying to convey. And while you may love those pieces, you know, they're not necessary to conveying the message or the anything you're trying to get across in your art. And so unfortunately, sometimes it's like the technology is like, hey, make those cuts so that you can still produce the end result that you want and still delivers the thing that you're looking to produce, even if you're having to make some of those trade-offs. And I think if you can identify those early, right, you save yourself a ton of effort and work that otherwise you may would have just lost. So.
Oh yeah. I mean, even on this design that you're seeing on the screen, we had like this felt, you know, I don't know if that's a fox or what that is, but it's like some kind of pelt that we thought was like, oh man, that's going to be so cool. But it just, you know, even on the design side of things, it became maybe a distraction, you know, because it's just a lot to look at. But this was actually the more going towards the cartoony, stylized, original design. And through the process, it started going more in this direction. As you could see, he's still very stylized, not necessarily human, but his musculature and anatomy is going a little bit towards realism in terms of proportions and detail. And this is kind of where we landed. I think this is probably close to our final, if not the final. So just a little, you know, the proportion is just a little bit more realistic, I guess you could say. And like Jesus mentioned, we just removed some of the things that might be considered problematic with the hair. Although we did keep some flowing chains and his necklace and the beads and that kind of thing, which we did have to do like cloth sobs on and figure that part out. So not to say that he was an easy character, but he was easier than he could have been if we would have.
Right.
Another consideration was size, because trying to find the right size and how that fits with the Echo character. It might not sound like a big deal, but when you start framing shots and doing choreography on the short, it can make the world of difference if he's too big or too small. Getting that right balance between big and not too big is something that we did, like these kind of wedge tests to kind of see how it felt with Echo, and then also brought it into Unreal to see how he started framing against the certain camera shots. Another thing, just as the temple, we wanted to base his textures and materials and skin and all that based on something real. So we referenced, in this case, rhinos and elephants. In the story, he was originally human that transformed over time into this kind of creature-esque kind of character. So we wanted to have like this tough hide type of vibe to his skin. Also, like the temple, we wanted to have we wanted to reference a lot of realism and real life type of costuming and in this case armor. So we referenced a lot of Japanese armor and try to add some of that detailing in there. And some of the things I liked about the armor that helped, I think, make Oni feel more interesting was the contrast between the shiny metal and the metals that you see in samurai costumes, but also the fabrics. If you look at these images, you see a lot of fabrics, and it's either functional to tie the armor plates, but it's also kind of decorative as well. So I thought that was kind of interesting. And here's some more examples. Not all of this is samurai armor. I think the bottom right is Game of Thrones, actually. But when you're working on materials and designing your looks and all that, anything is a fair game, just as long as it gives you and informs you what type of surface you're trying to design and how the specular rolls off the surface and what kind of detailing and all that. So, we collected all types of reference. And here's just an example of, I think this is not the final Oni coloring and all that, but this is an example of how we were using call out sheets to give information to our texture artists to try to get that same type of look that we were seeing in the reference. Oh, it's a shot of Oni, and yeah, that's basically the end of our slide presentation. But we wanted to open this up to questioning, and we also have the Unreal scene here open as well in case you guys wanted to take a look inside the project itself.
Yeah, buddy.
Awesome. Well, thank you. Yeah, we've got some questions, so we'll just dive right in. So you said the short was it ended up being right around a minute long with the 2 characters. They're wondering, what was the overall size of your team, and how long did it take you to make it in total?
Ooh, that's a trick question. Because the team size grew over time, but we kind of had it in almost like a traditional production type of pipeline, in the sense that we started with the modeling first. So we had I believe a team of about like 6 generalists, meaning modeling, texturing. So building the tempo mostly, and then we had a couple character artists helping on Oni. Mainly one character artist, but we had another character artist that helped on like the musculature and that kind of thing, and a couple of animators and a few lighters, and yeah, it was probably about like 10 people maybe max.
No, we were over. We're like 14, maybe 15 people total. Yeah, because I was just going down the names of like, these guys were all on it, and then yeah, we immediately hit over 10 very quickly. So
it's one of those things like when we have multiple projects as well, so sometimes people come in and out, but I would say if it was 15, it wasn't all 15 at once. It was, we kind of handled this in stages. So
absolutely. Yeah.
And then how long was it in development? Yeah.
Yeah. I'd say like a year or 2. Because it was like one year of full development, I believe, right?
No, it was actually, we started and a pandemic hit like around March. So we started the design we were still actually like kind of figuring out design, because we had originally a different female character, so then that shifted, and then we had to change Oni design, so we kind of had to go back to the drawing board, so to speak, which added more time. And then the pandemic delayed a lot of production things that we weren't anticipating, like mocap, for example. It took us forever to find a mocap facility that would allow their actors to go in during the pandemic, and that was a lot of logistical kind of things that we had to figure out. And I remember that date just kept getting pushed and pushed and pushed, like months and months and months. So what would have been like month 2 ended up being like month 5 on that animation. So we used that time to actually focus on the story, because as I mentioned, the story changed right when we started to hit production. So we had to scramble and create a new story. And so we spent a lot of that time actually prevising and coming up with the right blend of shots and how do we set this thing up? How do we tell this story with Echo in it and still make sense? And so that took up like probably 4-ish months, just back and forth. And again, everything was just slowed down times 10 because of the pandemic. Another thing that caused what I feel was a longer probably than usual production time period was we were working in 4.6 beta. And so we were, through that process, we were, I wouldn't say beta testing, but we were discovering new tools and sometimes bugs. Yeah. And so sometimes, those type of situations slowed us down as well. And we knew that was part of the process. It was kind of part of the collaborative nature of this project with Epic. So, but once we started getting to the swing of things with the shots, I would say probably a couple, 2 to 3 months on shots, and then it paused again because of the pandemic and so on. But I would say the whole thing was probably about 6 to 8 months if we were to condense it back down to what it should have been.
I was counting just straight time that we were just on it. I wasn't trying to condense it.
Well, yeah, I think it's important to mention the pandemic
regularly. Yeah. Normally.
Yeah. This was like a
6 to 8 months. Yeah.
Yeah, exactly. Like, and even faster now. And as I mentioned, this was our first animated project, so we were learning while we were doing this. So now that we have the experience, it
hit us in the back end as well with optimization, because the one thing we also forgot, not necessarily forgot, but we kept in the back of our minds, and it was just a matter of like, when are we going to get to it? When are we going to get to it? Was optimization, because we knew it was going to have to go out. We knew people were going to have to get to it, but it was a thing of like, yeah, we have to get these shots done. It became a movie mentality of like, yeah, but once we're done, we're done. It's like, no. We still have to optimize. Like, we still have to get this ready. And it's like, yeah, but after the shots are done, it's like, okay, once the shots are done, then you give me time, right? And it's like, yes, we swear. And then I finally got time to get into it, and it was like, okay, let's do it.
And you bring up an interesting point, Jesus, because just to kind of show to the audience that there's different ways you could use something like Unreal Engine, and something like this, what we call final pixel, which is basically the final rendering comes from the engine itself. There's no compositing. It's just like a one-to-one. If you're doing like a render out of Unreal to create a short, then in theory, you don't necessarily need to worry as much about certain things like frame rate, certain optimizations. I mean, obviously you need to be able to get it to render in the first place. So there's always optimization in mind. But if you're going to be playing this in real time as a video game, or in this case for us, a sample project, not everybody has the 390 card or whatever it is that, the powerful system. So we did have to go through an extra optimization process just for the sample project so that people could be able to play it at home. And in most cases, if you're a studio or a student or someone that's trying to put out your own short out there in the world, that might not be something you need to worry about. So this was kind of like a dual extra thing that we had to do just specifically for this project.
Which also,
so on that note,
you go for it.
Well, I was going to
drag this question out further
about the sample project, but if you have something to chime in, feel free to go with that first.
Well, it was just more to stay in line with the optimization thing about like what ended up dragging us further. And if I can share my screen real quick, it was also a part of like talking to Ed and all the artists about like textures and materials and making sure that like, hey, make sure we are getting the most bang for our buck. because right now, like even in this project, if we go into our settings and go into shader complexity, right now the heaviest shaders are effectively all of the shaders that have been vertex painted. So all of these guys have some sort of vertex painting that was done, you know, by all of our artists. And it was a conversation of, does everything need this? We have to be sure this needs this, or you can do it in a texture. Because if you can't do it in a texture, I will allow it. But it was a thing of we're trying to save as much as we can on our frame rate so we can hit our deliverable. That it was like, we just need to make sure that these are going well, and that, you know, we're not slapping vertex painting on everything just because we can. It was we have to be concise with this and make sure that like we're all on the same page for that. But yeah, that was my extending this further.
No. All right. So going back then to the sample project, you know, you put all this work into making this awesome thing that we've been able to release on the marketplace. If folks go and open it, what all can they find in there? For those that haven't explored the project.
So the purpose of the sample project was to have a one-to-one as much as possible to what you're seeing in the actual short. So the goal was to be able to hit play and open up the sequencer and actually have the entire thing play out in real time. So that's what that was the goal, and that's what we had to do, and that's where the optimization came in. But you also could find the characters, obviously, the Oni character, the Echo character, and all the assets and everything that we showed in the short. So the intention, one of the intentions of this short was also for to share, right? To share like a project like this, so some people could pull it apart and learn from what they're seeing inside the project, and along with the tutorial stuff and educational stuff that we're going to be creating, follow along and be able to kind of use this as a case study of sorts to learn some new techniques and tips.
And you've been working on those courses. Do those specifically reference the sample project that you've created? Then it'll kind of walk through or break down some of those elements that you've built?
Yeah, more or less. So the course is actually going back to this idea of us being they refer to VAD, but VAD is kind of a misleading term because VAD is a generic term for what it means is virtual art department. And when we're working on something like a Mandalorian, virtual art department handles the environments that go on the screen and so on. But in our experience, virtual art departments also do more than just, you know, what we think of as like an LED screen type of work. There's a lot of virtual production techniques and processes that are applicable to something like an animated short. It's not just, you know, filmmaking or in the sense of like real life actors and on set. And so we actually use a lot of those virtual production techniques to make this everything from the mocap, using the live link tool that enabled us to see the characters move live while the mocap actors were doing their thing on stage. Like those kind of virtual tools are the kind of tools that are used in virtual production. So that's the exciting thing about where Unreal is and is heading, is that it makes it so much easier to work as a team in remote type settings. So you could have someone in the UK, someone else here in California, and you can't really tell because you're all working in a virtual environment and in a way that is conducive to a team being able to jump on this together and create something pretty cool.
They were actually asking what that was like doing this collaborative process remotely, and so how are you all? How do you go about that process in making sure that everybody can access the files and is reviewing things together or working on the project? Could you speak a little more to that?
Yeah. Well, I think like the process. I got it. So I think that is the good thing for us as a studio is that Slay kind of forced us to develop that really quickly, because as every single business in the world that had to in some way do that on their own, we used the combination of, you know, Zoom and this tool called Sync Sketch that we introduced to Epic, that now is, I think you guys are using it for most projects, which is an awesome tool, by the way. SyncSketch allowed us to have live reviews with like the animation director and be able to draw on there and live and give notes and that kind of thing. So a lot of these kind of like virtual tools that came out during that pandemic, we definitely took advantage of and kind of made our own and kind of fit that into our pipeline. So it was a little bit of duct tape in the beginning, and as the time went on, it just became a little bit more streamlined. So
also in terms of like project management and making sure that all the artists were working on the same thing and no one was behind, we used Perforce. And to anybody in working on anything, even if you're working by yourself, please have some form of source control. Have a means of having a history that you can revert to, because there have been projects where you might have corruption and all of a sudden your project is gone, or you might have saved, but then all of a sudden like it was just weird stuff that happens. Have source control, have some form of source control. We used Perforce, and that allowed us to like in real time have assets checked out that then other artists would be like, hey, I need that asset. Why can't I do anything? Or we'll have an artist work on an asset even though it's checked out, and then learn the hard way that, oh yeah, you've now created an issue where I have to fix it, and we now have to like figure this merge, and someone is still losing work. So it definitely, like, that was also part of the duct taping of like, we need to figure out and have our communication be open with each other of like, hey, I have Oni checked out, so I'm working on all these materials. Whereas another artist is like, okay, got it. Let me know when you're ready so I can hop back in and do my stuff. It's like, cool. I'll keep you posted.
Perforce is definitely integral to our pipeline and common software used for video game production as anybody working in anything real time probably knows. But it's Perforce is great.
It'll save.
And that's for that was for everyone, right? It's artists, it's programmers, it's everybody's in there. So I know someone was asking.
And Unreal makes it super friendly in terms of having source control. Actually, if we can just hop quickly to the to my screen real quick. There's literally a button up here that'll the moment you hit that, it'll ask you for a control connection, and then just go through there. It'll already have presets of these are the ones that it'll accept and that it will, be super simple for you to use. Click on that and kind of go through it. We use Perforce, so all of the stuff that we have and that we have set up, we can just copy and paste, and then we just hit accept settings, and then it'll program this. It'll sync this entire file to your actual Perforce account, so that way they're one-to-one, and then you're good to go. Everything you do now is synced up to everyone else on the team, and you can hit the ground running and start actually and just also don't forget to submit, because when you have source control, there is a like checkout and then submit. So just because you have something checked out doesn't mean it's automatically going to be submitted. That is still a manual process. So just something to keep in mind.
And I think this kind of highlights the fact that Unreal is kind of set up for this type of collaborative type of workflow, and which is why we chose it as a tool, because especially with pandemic, it's something that is conducive to working as a team, as opposed to not to downplay anything like a Maya or anything like that, but traditional visual effects software, you're kind of working and on your own, and you have to submit it elsewhere. So something like Perforce with Unreal like gave us like this pipeline really quick that would have taken a lot longer for us to develop on our own. So
nice. They're wondering if you all use Control Rig in UE.
Ooh, I would say I'll take this one, because for this project we did. We absolutely did. For all of our other projects, because we don't really do characters, we don't. But in the last project we worked on, we also ended up using Controller, because it really comes in handy when you wanna. Yeah.
It was a mixture, because at the time, 4.26 beta, I think it was still in its early phases, and so we used it for some some things, some aspects, but just to be fully transparent, we did also do traditional keyframing. So it was just a little bit of a mixture of traditional keyframing with control rig.
Yeah, it was just very dependent on the note, and then whether or not we could hit it in real time in the engine, or we felt like it just had to go back to an animator.
Yeah.
So when, yeah, they were kind of curious about your experience with it. So when did you find it was valuable versus when did you prefer leaning on traditional keyframe animation?
So within a production setting, if it's a note that we know we can hit like super quickly and that we know we can just knock it out then and there, that's basically when we want it, because it's very quick, it's very easy to set up, and it's easy within that regard, versus it's a note where it's like no, the arm has to like come in through here and then dip down and then come up and then like twist around and then like backhand. That's when we're like, okay, that goes back to Maya. We're not going to touch that.
But it is something that, at least personally, I'm like, having more things in engine makes things 1,000% easier. So I'm excited that that control rig exists and that it's continued to be developed, because that would be the holy grail, to have everything, even animation inside UE. Looking forward to that.
So leaning on that, they were wondering what DCC and texturing tools were you using for your project? For
texturing, we used mostly Substance Painter for texturing, and then also Quixel's Mixer. Quixel Mixer was actually very handy for this project, because when Jesus was showing you the temple there in the red, and he mentioned Vertex Shading, one of the challenges for us was to create a non-tileable type of look, because these surfaces are so large. If you actually go inside the project sample and you look at the characters, like these towers and walls are huge, and when you add a real world one-to-one scale of a texture on there, in order to keep that fidelity and make it feel like you could almost touch the surface, you have to have a lot of texture resolution. But because of the scale of these actual structures, we had to tile it. And when you start tiling the texture, you start seeing the seams, and it just becomes very obvious. So using a tool like Mixer enabled us to visualize how we can mix and match different surfaces, and how we would reveal one layer from another, so one surface from another. And then that was designed in a program like Mixer, brought into UE, and then using something like a Vertex shader, we would put each of those textures on different layers, and then use the brush paint tool to reveal details here and there, and that way we can mask surfaces that were tiling or anything that looked like repetitive. And then Substance Painter is obviously kind of like our bread and butter when it comes to texturing characters and PBR type workflows for any objects or characters, the temple, anything. So
cool. Do we have any more questions from chat? Going to do a last call for y'all. And so while we're waiting, do you all have any other things? I feel like you've been itching to jump in the editor. Is there anything you want to show off, or that might be interesting to share?
I would say,
you guys want to talk a little bit about the lighting, maybe? Like, I know we haven't talked about lighting too much. I know that Travis and myself.
Travis doesn't have his mic operational.
Okay.
It looks like we either have his face or we have his voice.
But lighting was something that was super challenging and fun, and using Unreal for lighting is a joy. I mean, I personally love using Unreal for lighting, because you get that immediate results, and for us to be able to experiment with the different lighting scenarios and where the light's coming from and lighting design is just awesome to do in real time. And
I mean, if you want, I can try to do something along those lines, because I do have a decent shot that I feel like covers what I want to talk about, and a little bit of lighting as well, as because it's definitely one of those. Yeah, so if we can jump onto my screen, it was one of those shots where Oni kicks Echo, where a lot of our lighting, like as you can see here, we already have a couple of blockers that we're trying to get to make sure that some of this light that's coming in isn't coming in for this shot. And let's just go a little bit, connect to our camera.
Yeah, this is referring to what I mentioned in the beginning, that because of the design of the temple, it became challenging to light because there's all these tall structures that were initially blocking the sun. And so for us to pick a lighting direction for the sun as a starting point, we had to experiment with what gave us the kind of best average. And I think this is what Jesus is going to show here. But on a per shot basis, we had to hide things sometimes. So, for example, if we wanted to get a certain look on the characters and be able to rim light them and all that, sometimes we had to use a sequencer to hide like an entire structure that was out of frame that you wouldn't be able to tell. But by doing that, it would give us the lighting that we needed to fill in the characters. And so while that might be considered a cheat, that was, I think it's a pretty common type of workflow. And using something like sequencer gave us the ability to hide that on a shot per shot basis.
Oh yeah, absolutely. And also that's not even to mention like the amount of fill lights and rec lights and spotlights that we use per character and per shot, where let me just turn off game mode so we can see everything. But it's like we have, you know, we have lights being turned on and off as Echo and Oni are running into specific like specific parts, because like as we're going through here, we'll have spotlights with like very low intensities, cool colors to make sure that once we start hitting on these characters, that it starts highlighting what we want to highlight. So in this instance, like you can see part of here, Oni's back. If we go to this, you know, char kick SR, you can start seeing some of the light that was supposed to be bouncing on and even down onto his leg being off and on. And it's only meant for Oni and only meant for like him getting to this rim light, because that's what's going to make it look good. And so let me snap into camera real quick, go to that same one and just start turning stuff off and on. Like we'll start seeing, you know, the shots start to look not exactly where we want it. And we're also using subsequences, so that way everything isn't grouped into one massive sequencer, and it'll also allow artists to be able to work in a shot it'll allow more than one artist to work into a shot. So in this case, we have our lighting sequencer, our lighting subsequence, and there's like 55 tracks. It'll tell you right there of how much stuff is being basically added into the scene. So we'll have, you know, our fog mid-ground to add that nice little layer of fog there, and then we'll have our rec lights being spawned in only for this, modifying our directional lights per shot, which is why early on when I was saying, yeah, the stylized lighting that we had was going to just make it wild, because it goes into this, where there's a lot of little detailed lighting that we add to make the character really pop, to give the highlights that we're looking for. Whereas if we just slap two directional lights, call it a day, because like that's, you know, technically realistic lighting, it's not the, and I'm putting hard quotes around this, the realistic lighting that we're actually shooting for. You know, it's the movie lighting where like we're getting the cool fill lights of like, oh yeah, this is the highlight of the like Echo and she's looking like super cool here, and this is Oni looking there, and like the highlights on his shoulders make him look more intimidating, and it's like, we need to keep that. It's like, well, the directional lights won't give us that. It's like, okay, slap a spotlight. I'm like, all right, it's not real. No, I said what I said, slap that spotlight. And
yeah, sequencer gave us the ability to become more theatrical and just shoot the way they would, you know, in a traditional film, where every single shot has to be designed and lighting has to move and all that. So being able to hide and expose the lights and change intensities per shot with sequencer was pretty integral to our pipeline on the show.
Oh yeah.
So yeah,
same thing goes with like our effects, where we'll have life cycles, you know, from our Niagara systems. And instead of using the whole life cycle, we can trigger exactly where we want it. And then at the same time, let's just say we didn't want the full life cycle of, this puff. We can immediately start cutting out what part we don't want and what parts we do want. And it'll just still use it at, like, frame by frame. You can see here as like Echo's getting hit, the Niagara effect is already moved into position, and then now it's being triggered, it kicks off, and then it dissipates as it goes on. Yeah.
Test. You hear me at all?
Oh, yeah.
Hey. Yeah.
Okay. So I apologize. I changed one of my settings and I can talk, but it's been actually really nice just to be silent this whole thing. I was actually hoping to get through the whole thing without having to jump in. But I just wanted, sorry about that. I just wanted to add that I think, Ed, one of the things after I make this comment, it'd be nice for you to talk about is that the whole project was kind of done as a test project to stress test the studio with a very small team. And that was something that was really unique that I liked about Mold3D because I joined late into the project. And a lot of times studios don't take the time to do projects like this. And while we get kind of stress tested on every project that we do, there's always something you run into with the Unreal Engine that you just don't know that you didn't know. And, this project was unique in how fast can you put this project together with a small team and push it out. And then you get the pandemic thrown on top of it. So it was pretty interesting. But I wanted to add with the lighting that part of giving this project away, a big advantage for anybody watching here is anybody just getting started in Unreal. Like if you have art school, even if you don't have art school, if you want to be a lighter, you can jump into this project and go in and create a dramatic light setup of your own. Go in and tackle how you might light this scene. Excuse me, I have a cold. But if you want to work for a studio, a great way to work for that studio, especially is if you get a set like this, to be able to go in and relight that scene and show us like a daytime version, nighttime version. What does it look like if it's overcast? What does it look like at 12 o'clock noon? Being able to show us your thought process in a portfolio is amazing. That's one of the hardest things for artists to do on their own. That's usually where your mentor, your teacher is kind of directing you. But the problem with that is that's your mentor, your director's artistic choices. So when you jump in with this project, whether it be animation or lighting or whatever it is, Mold3D can specifically see like, okay, I understand how you think. And it makes it really easy for me to make you an offer because if I like the way that you think and I like the quality of what you can put out on a project that's already belonging to us, there really isn't no need for that transition of like, can you do it or not? So I think that's a huge advantage for Epic giving this away. Is that it allows, those upcoming artists or even professional artists to jump in. And I'll even say this too. There's a lot of professional artists that I'd love to see take this test, right? And that's not to be mean, but we can get comfortable or we can go to the kind of same presets with lighting or with animation, things that you get in the habit of doing over and over. So jump into this project if you want a job and then show us what you could do. Like that's really one of the biggest benefits of having this project out there right now.
I think it's just yes. But no, this is kind of like the original intention of the project was actually pre-fellowship. So Unreal has Epic has a great fellowship educational course that uses different kits and environments and Echo. I think in some cases now MetaHumans, and so it's kind of similar in that sense where students take those project elements, models, and kind of starting point, and then using that to kind of develop their own stories and practice and create their own kind of vision with Unreal. And that's what Unreal gives, I think, every artist is the ability to create something really cool looking fast and to be able to go in there and just experiment and have fun and see what you get out of it. So I think hopefully people enjoy the project and be able to do something really cool with it. But I think for us, the most important thing was just to create this project to inspire and to show people that, hey, anybody could do it. It's just, you just got to go through the process, and going through that process would be very rewarding. And when you come out of it, you're going to find yourself with new skills and knowledge that you wouldn't have had before. So I feel that Unreal gives you that ability more than a non-traditional kind of, or a traditional visual effects type program, which is great.
So there were a couple questions based on the lighting, or about the lighting. They're wondering, was any of it actually baked, or was it all real time or dynamic rather?
Real time and dynamic. Just because it's a shot by shot basis, like it had to be. There was no, like, we could have baked down the overall lighting for the temple as a whole, but the fact that these are dynamic characters, the focus is on dynamic characters, we had to. It needed to be all dynamic.
Awesome. I'll jump in on that one and say, if,
Sure.
if you want beautiful lighting, you're going to need baking. But this project, again, going back to the fact that it is a stress test for the team, and also just when I say stress test, that includes your hardware, right? If you're, on a 2080 Ti, if you're on a 3090, a lot of studios we've found through our projects, there's a lot of studios out there right now that want to be Unreal Studios. And when you talk to them about the hardware, you find out that, hey, before you're worried about the artist, you need to worry about the machines you're on. Like, depending on what you want to do at what level, like, you have to have that professional level machine. For us, we wanted to see with a 2080 Ti, how far could we push it? And ray tracing will show you that very quickly. So
Very quick.
What Jesus is saying is true, but with this project, it was kind of, this is a ray tracing only project. You wouldn't necessarily make that choice on production, right? Like I said, right now at the time, depending on what your hardware and your kit is you're going to want to have baked light to get beautiful lighting. But this was an interesting experiment to see, like, can we push this all the way with ray tracing? How far can we push it without breaking it, so to speak? So that if you're jumping into the project and it's super heavy, it's kind of supposed to be, right? Like, and some of that comes down
that made
to
optimization. Yeah, that made it a lot tougher too to get to that.
Yeah, buddy.
They're wondering, when you exported or rendered the scene, were there any specific settings you found useful to keep the expected quality?
We actually had to go above and beyond the expected quality. There was, I believe the settings are in the project itself, because I remember Ed and I talking about this, and we were going at, we were modifying the numbers and seeing because we used movie render queue, and we were seeing what was giving us the best results. And also a part of the project comes with those results as well, to push what you're seeing above and beyond what is in Unreal and to what it can actually look like. Because there's a lot of settings that were disabled to allow us to be more performant, in just so you can run around and still see all the shots. But then the moment you kick out the renders, and this is where Travis is saying in terms of, like, your machine has to be ready for it, which is all the settings bump up that quality back to where it needs to be, to where it can start making your UE crash if you don't have enough RAM for it.
Yeah, but there was definitely we try to keep it as much one-to-one as possible, but there was some settings that for sure gave it a little bit of a bump once we did the final renders.
So open up the project and check it out.
Exactly.
Throughout the optimization passes, was there anything you cut from the project that they wouldn't see in the sample now, but they think would be need to know about? You talked about, like, removing the hair. I mean, that was a little earlier than the optimization passes, but anything later in the project that you're like, this just doesn't quite make it?
I've got one, but if you guys have one, I'll let you guys go first.
No, go for it.
Okay. Textures. And it's not necessarily that we cut the textures, but it was more that we reduced their size. So we didn't necessarily re-import them in as, like, 1K, but there were textures that we had that were at high resolution. Like, the majority of our textures came in almost at 4K, majority of the time. And because of that, our texture stream pool ran out really quickly. So in terms of cut, we more of cut the resolution. So if you ever go into the project and start opening up and seeing, like, oh, these don't look that great, you can go into the texture and then reset the resolution back to its original setting. But in terms of actual cutting, we didn't necessarily cut anything. It was for optimization.
Yeah, I don't think so.
Just for optimization. It was more in the creative portion was where we were cutting.
Yeah.
Cool. That's great though, if you're able to keep. It's like you've saved you're saved yourself the effort by cutting things early, or we're still able to maintain a lot of the work you had at the end anyway. So that's great.
Absolutely.
So they were asking, was this project being, so this is more around like the business, but was this project being juggled alongside other commercial projects or demos, or was it your sole focus? But if juggled, how do you manage working on multiple projects at once?
That's a good question. No, yeah, I mean, we had, I think, it kind of varied throughout the course of it, but we had, on average, we have about like 3 or 4 projects going on at once. So we have artists, like I was explaining before, it's not all like 15 people working on a project at once. You know, we get through the modeling, and then those people might come off this project and go into another project. And once we're done with the texturing, the same thing. So I think like for the most part, it's a pretty, like, you have to juggle your resources, but yeah, it's a situation where we do have to kind of have people come in and out. So
I think something worth noting, Ed, too, is just it's a bit like a boxing arena at a few times when you're juggling in 3 or 4 projects, because it's more than juggling 3 or 4 projects. It's working on a project in Unreal 5 with one studio. It's working on an Unreal project 4.26 with another studio. So on one hand, you have virtual textures, and you have, hey, we're going to use nanite, and we can have as many polys as we want. But you get that texture stream still, right? And on the other project, you're going back to, hey, we can't have as many polys as we want. So it's also going through, those different hurdles of like being in what specific engine you're at what point. So I think that's an interesting aspect as well, because a lot of times in production, if you're working in Maya, you'll never upgrade that Maya for 2 or 3 years if you're in a project, right? Because you just don't want things to change. And so it has been something that I think we take as in pride as a studio of being able to now comfortably go back and forth, because if you work in them long enough, you kind of know where those limitations in each are, or where you can make suggestions to the studio or on the project. So I think that's become a big strength of ours, even though in the beginning it feels like you're getting beat up a little with it.
Yeah.
How do you juggle or have those conversations with teams? Are there times where you sit down and sort of recommend it? It's like, hey, this is the amount of work it's going to take on this engine version. This would be the advantage to upgrading. And how do you weigh the effort of upgrading the engine maybe mid-project versus, just rolling through without features that would be maybe a lot easier.
That's a good cop, bad cop thing, right?
That's a conversation I always fight for. Never, ever in the middle of a project, especially in the middle, never. But you hit those points where it's like, if we version up, a lot of our issues will be gone. And then the other bad side, the bad cop to that is, but how much of our own work will we have to redo? And how much of that will be gone? Like, how much of our materials do we have to redo? And it's like, the majority of the times, not a lot, and it's not often, but there's always those like moments where you do, and then you start losing stuff where it scares the absolute life out of you. But oftentimes, from all the stuff that I've experienced, we do just end up versioning up, and it becomes a smooth process. It's a thing where it's like it's before the jump. Before you jump in and like version up, it's like no, don't. But then you jump, it's like, oh, the pool wasn't that shallow. Okay, cool. Let's keep moving.
Amanda, are you talking risky, about? Go ahead, Ed.
No, go ahead.
Oh, I was just saying that the good cop, bad cop thing, I think Ed and I, and Jesus as well, I thought you were talking more about when we're working with a client, right? And whether or not they want to work in Unreal Engine 5 or in 4.26 or 4.27. And Ed, you could probably talk about the good cop, bad cop type thing, because with a client, you have to walk that delicate line. You can't say, well, no, it's not time to use Unreal Engine 5 now. You have to kind of respect what they want. You're getting paid. You're working for them, right? So we do give that advice, but it's how much you push that advice. And I think Ed does that very delicately and really well. So I'm the aggressive one, and I think Ed is the adult in the room. Ed, do you have anything to say to that?
I mean, it's just that with any new version or technology, there's always going to be changes that you might not know about, or even some bugs. So, I mean, I try to, like Jesus was saying, try not to do that kind of thing if possible. But at the same time, you also want to take advantage of the new tools and lighting systems or Lumen in the case of UE5, that kind of thing. So it's tempting, but yeah, it's something that's not necessarily suggested.
Cool. Well, we've made it to the end of our questions. Is there any notes you'd like to leave for the community, or any recommendations on, getting in, or how to start this journey? If they want to,
I think for me,
I think it's opening the sample project, right?
yeah, I mean, I think just I hope that like our talk about the journey of creating this project just inspires people to just go about and do their own, because it's just about starting, taking that leap and getting in there, getting your hands dirty, and just going through the process. And you might go in there not knowing tons of stuff, but you're going to figure it out through the process, and at the end come with a whole new tool set and knowledge that you didn't have before. So I would just say, just go for it, and you can't learn until you try. So hopefully start making stuff. Yeah.
Start. Yeah.
Well, awesome. It sounds like our folks should definitely keep track of what you're up to at mold3dstudio.com. They can see lots of other works from your team and the cool things you're doing. And if they take Travis's advice and light the scene, then maybe they can apply for a job one of these days. First of all, we want to say thank you all for joining us and walking through your process. It's the concept art and all of that was absolutely beautiful, and Slay's awesome. So thank you for putting that together, putting the sample project out. That's no small feat. And so it's a really great resource for the community, and I appreciate you all doing that.
Thank you, Amanda, for having us today, and thanks to everyone for watching.
Thank you very much.
Appreciate it.
Yeah, so
thanks,
for
everyone. Thanks, Amanda.
our folks, follow us on all the social things / or at Unreal Engine. If you're watching it on YouTube, there will be a transcript up in about a week, so you can search for all the cool things you want to find. Let us know what you thought of today's stream. Are there topics you'd like to see in the future? We'll be dropping a survey in chat. Fill that out and let us know. We will be back next week for the year in review with Tim Sweeney. It's our final show of the year before we head on to holiday break. So yeah, again, thank you all so much. Community, I hope you have an absolutely wonderful week. Explore the Slay Sample Project, and we'll see you then. All right, thank you all.
Thanks, everyone.
See ya.
Bye.